Hey everybody, in this video I wanted to start a series of videos where I will take a closer look at Bible verses that are problematic for Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, some Christians might argue that the whole Bible is a problem for Jehovah's Witnesses, but I want to look at specific explanations of certain verses that don't quite synchronize with their own teachings. You would think the least the governing body can do is make sure teaching X does not contradict teaching Y. But as mentioned in an earlier video, reading the Bible in context was the turning point for me and my awakening. I can think of no better phrase than take the text out of the context, you'll be left with nothing but a con. And with this first video, I will probably illustrate one of the biggest cons the governing body has pulled on the majority of Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, the aim of this series is not to discuss the true meaning of these verses, but simply to examine what the interpretation of the governing body is on these verses and whether or not it can stand on its own. So I decided to start on Romans chapter 8. Now, just to give you some background, Jehovah's Witnesses teach that only a few Christians can go to heaven, and they go to heaven to rule with Jesus over the earth, where the rest of mankind will be. Now, these Christians number 144,000, and they're the only ones that partake of the bread and wine at Jehovah's Witness memorials. So if you wanted to know how many there were, let's say in 2020, you would simply consult the 2020 service report. And the number reported in there is 21,182, or 15% of the 144,000 are alive today. So if you were to ask a Jehovah's Witness, how does someone know whether or not they're going to heaven or staying on earth? They will take you to Romans chapter 8, specifically Romans 8:15 to 17. And they will say something like this.
Simply put, by means of His Holy Spirit, God makes it clear to that person that he is invited to become a future heir in the kingdom arrangement.
So, one of the biggest, most important teachings of the Jehovah's Witnesses is actually based on God making it clear to just one person or to a few individuals that they're going to heaven. And this is why you start to wonder, why didn't God bother providing this evidence to everyone else to make it clear to everyone that these people are going to heaven? Now, remember when I said earlier that the issue with most, if not all, teachings of Jehovah's Witnesses are with the context? Well, let's prove this. Let's have a look at the context of Romans chapter 8 and see, firstly, if it would make sense based on the context that only a few Christians, numbering 144,000, are spiritual sons of God, so meaning they're going to heaven. Secondly, whether or not, based on the context of Romans chapter 8, this second class Christianity is logical. The first class being these 144,000 Christians who are going to heaven, and the second being the ones that are going to stay on the earth and be ruled over by Jesus and the 144,000. Romans 8 begins by comparing two types of people. So he compares a person who is led by the Spirit of God and one who is led by the human flesh. And it becomes very clear that Paul is actually comparing Christians and non-Christians. The reason for that is because he later says the person who is led by the Spirit of God, well, it means life, peace, God's Spirit dwelling in them, and them being in union with Christ. And then on the other hand, the one who is led by the human flesh, for them it means death, enmity with God, and they cannot please God. So it's very clear that Paul is comparing Christians to non-Christians. So with that context in mind, you really start to ask questions about this two-class Christianity, this other sheep and anointed teaching that Jehovah's Witnesses have running. Are the other sheep who are not going to heaven, are they led by God's Spirit? And if so, are they in union with Christ? You see, what Jehovah's Witnesses won't tell you is that the official teaching from when they began in 1879 till 1935 was that everyone who got baptized, became a Christian, became a Bible student, later to be called Jehovah's Witnesses, they would automatically, by default, be part of the 144,000 who are going to heaven. And so as they continue to grow, starting to get closer to the hundreds of thousands, they started to see that this is going to be a problem. They're going to have too many Christians going to heaven according to their own teachings. And so really their leader at the time, Joseph Rutherford, he created this masterstroke of a teaching that they still believe until today. And they do anything to really make it stick. So he came up with this other sheep teaching. And it's really you grabbed a few scriptures from, the Old Testament, some New Testament scriptures, grab them all, put them in the blender, and really that's what was developed. I'll make a video about the other sheep teaching later on, but when you think about that, you really start to see the great length this organization is willing to go to make their own teachings stick. This 144,000 teaching has to work no matter what, even if it means creating a new brand of Christianity. And so how does the governing body today harmonize Romans chapter 8 with all their other teachings about the other sheep and their anointed? Because remember, Romans chapter 8 repeatedly makes it clear that every Christian has to be in union with Christ, has to be led by God's Spirit, and thus they have to be a son of God. But that really contradicts what Jehovah's Witnesses teach today. So how do they do it? Well, I'd like to introduce to you the December 2016 Watchtower. Now, this is their latest up-to-date attempt of an explanation of how Romans chapter 8 synchronizes with their two-class Christianity. Now, it's here where I'd like to give my personal story, because this teaching was a real struggle for me to swallow. Now, when I mentioned earlier that my Bible reading was the turning point, this was one of the biggest parts of sort of a shock moment, a wait a minute moment of finding out that we really did not teach what the Bible very clearly states. So in my Bible reading, when I got to Romans chapter 8, I was really grappling whether or not I was one of the anointed, one of the 144,000. Now, this was a big deal because I was only 15. I was really undecided whether or not I should partake at the next memorial. And so I remember reading watchtowers that were basically dissuading people who were thinking they were anointed from partaking if they were either recently baptized or were young at age. And those two things, at 15, I was only baptized, less than 2 years. Yeah, so for a bit, I concluded that, okay, fair enough. I'm just going crazy. But when their governing body started making more appearances on our TV screens and just on JW Broadcasting, finding out more information about them, I started doing some digging on the members of the Faithful and Discreet Slave, just to find out when they thought they were anointed and when they started partaking. And suffice to say, I found some interesting things. I might make a video about this later, but one of the interesting things I found was that Nathan Orr, who was the third president of the Watchtower Bible Tract Society, was only 17 when he started partaking. And so for me, that was like, okay, well, that gives me the license to partake at a younger age. And so I made a plan that I was going to start partaking at the age of 20. But I'm so glad I never stayed until that age in this organization. But that was a real turning point for me, thinking I was basically on the same level as the governing body or the individual members of the governing body. It gave me sort of this freedom, courage, I can say, that I was really on. There was not much of a difference between me and your average member of the governing body. But I still believe they spoke for God as a group. And so now back to the Watchtower. December 2016 Watchtower. This was going to clear up a few things for me because I still couldn't reconcile the fact that we taught that only 144,000 could be led by God's Spirit, could be in union with Christ. Those were things that were really contradictory to the Bible. And so paragraph 2 of that Watchtower had this to say about who Romans chapter 8 is principally, now the key word being principally, addressed to.
Anointed Christians are those principally addressed in that chapter. They receive the Spirit as ones waiting for adoption as sons, the release from their fleshly bodies. Yes, their future is to be sons of God in heaven. That is possible because they became baptized Christians and God applied the ransom in their behalf, forgave their sins, and declared them righteous as spiritual sons.
So the Watchtower does what they're all so good at. The writers have been doing it for hundreds of years, and that is semantic games. You see, they introduce a phrase in the paragraph that is loaded with meaning, their own meaning that they've attached to, and that is anointed Christian. So with that, it means that you can also be a non-anointed Christian. Just think about it. Like the Watchtower teaches things, they'll have it teaching, but then within that same teaching, there'll be an aspect of that teaching that is completely opposite to what the whole teaching is about. How can someone be a non-anointed Christian? Like, to be Christian, it means you're like Christ. And what's the most obvious way you can be like Christ, according to Christians, is to be anointed, like Christ was. But Jehovah's Witnesses teach that you can also be a non-anointed Christian like Christ. It's so bizarre. It's like saying you can have a bus driver that's never driven a bus before and never will. You can have a soccer player who calls himself a soccer player, but he's never kicked a soccer ball and he's never played soccer at all. That's literally what they teach. You got to love it. The Watchtower continues.
However, Romans chapter 8 is also of interest to those who have the earthly hope, because God in a sense views them as righteous. We see an indication of that in what Paul wrote earlier in his letter. In chapter 4, he discussed Abraham. That man of faith lived before Jehovah gave the law to Israel and long before Jesus died for our sins. Still, Jehovah noted Abraham's outstanding faith and counted him as righteous. Jehovah can, in a similar way, consider as righteous the faithful Christians today who have the Bible-based hope of living forever on earth. Accordingly, they can benefit from the counsel found in Romans chapter 8 that is given to righteous ones.
Again, the writers of the Watchtower are so good at these arguments, semantic-based arguments. They start off by saying God, in a sense, views them as righteous. Now, the Watchtower uses this expression, in a sense, in a lot of their teachings that just cannot be defended. You cannot be a doctor, in a sense. You cannot be a lawyer, in a sense. A bus driver, in a sense. Righteous, in a sense. It's either you're righteous or you're not. But again, this is the level they have to argue on. And so one has to ask the question, in what sense does God view the other sheep righteous compared to the anointed? And then now in the same paragraph, they go on to just call them righteous altogether. So they started off by calling them righteous in a sense, and then they're just righteous. And so this is how Jehovah's Witnesses can believe this teaching. They can swallow it because in their view, they're just as righteous. But that's not the real teaching. The next thing they have to do is pull out a very disrespectful move, in my opinion, and that is to bring Abraham. Now, for most Christians, Abraham is really very high when it comes to faith and righteousness. He's actually one of the only persons in the Bible who's called God's personal friend. And so, what does the governing body do to all his faith? To all his righteousness? That's right, they gotta limit him. Jehovah's Witnesses want you to believe that Abraham's righteousness, his faith, is limited in degree compared to this group of bloated charlatans who basically are going to heaven to rule over people like Abraham and David. And so Jehovah's Witnesses, My message to you is, please be careful what grounds you argue on, because you will have to defend your beliefs on exactly the same grounds.